In this video we look at the basics of electronic warfare, how the Russian and Chinese approach to electronic warfare differs to the Western approach, how electronic warfare units are organized, and if an electronic magnetic pulse, an EMP, from a thermonuclear bomb can be considered electronic warfare or not. For this I talked with the right-hand analyst Thomas Wiffington, specializing in EW. If you want to know more, check out the links in the description. Like Tom's article on a theoretical framework for electronic maneuver in the Defense Horizon journal. So for the layman, basically, what is electronic warfare?
That is an excellent question. So the textbook definition of it really is it's military operations that are designed to frustrate the adversary's use of the electromagnetic spectrum for combat operations while preserving one's own use of that spectrum for one's own combat operations. So if you think about it, militaries fight in all dimensions. So they fight in the air, they fight on land, they fight at sea, now they fight in space as well. They also fight in the electromagnetic spectrum. But the tricky thing about the spectrum is it's the only environment where warfare occurs which we as humans have no ability to sense. So we can't taste, feel, touch, smell, see the spectrum. We see part of it because visible light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum. But where military electronic warfare takes place mainly is in the radio spectrum. And that is much further up where we can see, where we can hear. It's out of our sensory band, if you like. And it is primarily in the radio part of the spectrum. Now, that is a set of frequencies. You'll know this from your car radio, you know, from your Wi-Fi, all of these kind of things. And that typically goes from the start of the radio spectrum, which is about 0 kilohertz, and it goes up to about 300 gigahertz, I think, at the end of the day. So it's a big swathe of the electromagnetic spectrum. But fundamentally, EW, as it's known, is how militaries fight in the electromagnetic spectrum.
Basically, to put it simply, it's about frustrating the enemy in terms of his signaling capabilities as much as possible, but also, so it also encompasses radar as well. So would be cyber included in the EW spectrum already as well?
That's a very good question. So you're absolutely right. Electronic warfare, primarily in its purest form, is aimed against the military's use of radio and radar. Now, radar is effectively a form of radio. So what you're using with radar is you're using radio waves and you're transmitting them in order for those radio waves to hit an object and be reflected back to the radar. And by measuring how long that process takes, you can derive a huge amount of information about the target that you detect, if that's a ship or an aircraft or a vehicle, or whatever it might be. So both radar and radio are using the same part of the electromagnetic spectrum. They both use this radio segment, which is part of the spectrum. And cyber does increasingly come into this. And the reason why cyber is being included is because what used to happen on the battlefield is if you had the blue force and the red force, so the good guys and the bad guys, the blue force would want to do two things. They'd want to know what the red force is saying on their radios, and they'd also want to frustrate the ability of the red force to use those radios. And how they would do that is, if they wanted to frustrate the red force using those communications, is they jam them. And what that basically means is they would transmit huge amounts of interference, static, like you used to get on televisions. People probably don't have this anymore because they've got satellite and they've got cable. But I remember, you used to get static interference on the television aerial, and you get interference on the screen, all of that kind of thing. It's the same thing. You're basically using that interference to block out your enemy's ability to communicate by radio. But what's now happened with the cyber world is things have got much more sophisticated. So the blue force isn't just transmitting interference anymore. Many of the radios, in fact all the radios pretty much the modern army uses, are digital radios. So that means they're software controlled. Like our computers are, our cell phones, everything around us really is software controlled. This is the same for the military. So what you might want to do now is transmit an electronic attack, but you're not sending noise, sending interference out into the ether anymore into those Red Force radios, what you might be doing is sending malicious code. And you might be doing that because the command and control systems that the Red Force is using to maneuver troops, to work out what's happening on the battlefield, who is where is the enemy and all of this. It's just like in our daily lives. It's all computerized. It's all digitized now. So you're using these digitized command and control systems. And what you might want to do is use that electronic attack to send that malicious code in to those command and control systems so they no longer function properly. Or you might just simply be wanting to see what they're up to. So you're not doing anything malicious to the Red Force's computer systems. You're merely burrowing in and you're using a radio signal to do that. Find out what they're looking at. Maybe leave things completely alone, but just exploit the intelligence. Or equally, you might want to be putting in a cyber attack, which is very subtly changing things on the maps they have, for instance. Perhaps they think that this battalion is here and this is what they're doing with a very clever bit of manipulation, a very subtle manipulation of the code. Suddenly that battalion's no longer where it should be, or the enemy starts thinking it's in a completely different place doing something different. So you're absolutely right that cyber and electronic warfare are increasingly converging, and it's a very interesting development in the field.
So to a certain degree, there might be also a bit of an overlap with psychological warfare, with PSYOPs, but I assume that PSYOPs basically then uses part of the electronic warfare capabilities, but it's not part of it.
Absolutely. One of the things, for instance, with how the Russians see electronic warfare is, and the Chinese see it in a very similar way, is that they see electronic warfare and cyber warfare as part of a wider information operation. And that would include psychological warfare as well. It's slightly different from how NATO and allied nations and Western nations, let's say in general, have seen electronic warfare in the past. EW was very much a sort of separate thing, and it was highly secretive. It did its own thing. Not a huge amount was known about it, but it wasn't really put in this bracket of psychological operations, psychological warfare, information warfare. That is now changing. To give you an example of how it's changing, the British Army in 2018, I think it was, released what they called their CEMA doctrine, and that's the acronym is Charlie Echo Mike Alpha CEMA, and that stood for Cyber and Electromagnetic Activities. And the British are very much seeing these effects, so the electronic warfare effects and the cyber warfare effects, coming together. They still have very important differences, but they're doctrinally being seen as something that works with each other. They complement each other, if you like. And so, as you said, you're absolutely right. You've got this convergence that is going on, and it is bringing in these elements of information operations, psychological operations. And I think it's a reflection of how we use as people, really, as societies, how we use the electromagnetic spectrum in our daily lives. It's the way we get the football results, it's the way we check the news, it's the way we order a pizza. So we're very dependent on it. And if you think about it, that then becomes a very effective vector by which you can deliver a psychological effect or an information effect, if you wish.
So you mentioned that there's a bit of a different philosophy for the Chinese and the Russians. So in the sense, is this I heard it once. I did a video on Maskirovka many years ago, and it was quite interesting because the several articles I read, they were all over the place. Some called it Maskirovka, a complete strategy, what I found a bit overboarding. And I also found it very interesting to see comments from supposedly Russians, because there were two extremes. The one said, Maskirovka is just what you have, that's military deception. And the others were like, you have no idea what Maskirovka is. It's a deep part of the Russian soul, basically. And for me, it was like, that actually sounds like Maskirovka operations, because one person basically told me once, one aim of Maskirovka is that one basically gives up on believing that there is an actual truth. And so in that sense, for me, if they both were real Russians, it could actually have been that was in a way already Maskirovka again, because they said something completely different, and then in the end you say, I can't really know. Is this whole deception, because I also spoke to someone, I think from an Asian country, about Sun Tzu, or Sun Tzu, I think in English, and they always mentioned that deception is very important. And I think in Clausewitz on war, I think deception gets mentioned, but compared to the art of war, it's a very small part. So there's a stronger focus on this, or a differentiation in the West, that we say, okay, we do deception, but we do it, let's say, on a operational level, whereas for them it's a strategic or a grand strategic level. Is this correct, or how would you explain it?
I think I absolutely agree with what you're saying. Yes, I think we do. I think the Western sort of military, if you like, the Western way of war, certainly since the Second World War and probably before, has been to use deception at the operational level. D-Day is the classic example of this, and it's probably the most quoted one of all of these efforts that the Allies took, such as having a fictional army in the east of England, which was, I think, supposedly commanded by General Patton, fooling the German high command into where the invasion would make landfall in France. And there was this huge, and it went on for a very long time. I mean, I think it was almost about a year before the invasion. This deception effort, which Operation Fortitude, I think it was known, went on. And then I think you saw it again. I mean, the first Gulf War was a very interesting example of that, because you saw, for instance, you had I think there was a Marine expeditionary unit that was stationed off the coast of Kuwait, ready to do an amphibious landing. And the whole idea was to convince the Iraqi high command that, okay, this is going to be a huge part of the operation, is there's going to be an opposed landing in Kuwait City with the US Marines. Whereas what actually happened was Schwarzkopf did this very clever maneuver, this kind of wide left hook into Iraq, and cutting off the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we in the West have tended to see it more as a operational level thing. I think that might be a difference between regimes as well, to an extent. I think it's probably harder for us as societies to feel comfortable with using using deception at that level against another nation. I think it sort of would probably go against, I think, where a lot of decision makers would position themselves from an ethical level, which sounds quite strange. You think, okay, well, you know, this is war. I mean, how do we navigate this? But I suspect that may be part of the problem. One of the interesting things I remember from reading about the Second World War was that the BBC became a very important organisation during the war in terms of sharing information. And I think I've got this right, that the official edict to the BBC was that they were not allowed to produce false news. So they could report on things, but they could not produce anything that was false. And when something bad had happened, or when there was something that had occurred that potentially could have been either strategically or operationally very useful to the Axis powers, it was just simply not reported. That was how it was dealt with, rather than using disinformation. So there's two competing philosophies, I think, that are at work here. And in many ways, you could argue that there's an information competition that is going on. And that is occurring in the electromagnetic spectrum, because it's how we get that information, whether that is delivered by cable or whether it's delivered by satellite, whatever the vector, the means of delivering that information is, whether it appears on social media, whether it's on a TV broadcast, whatever it is probably going to need to use the electromagnetic spectrum at some point to get from where it's being produced to its consumer. And so you've got this grey zone now where you've got electronic warfare moving in to the sort of civilian realm as well, if you like, or the sort of I don't know what you call it, parapublic realm, I suppose, that kind of thing. So there is a huge strategic impact that it's having as well. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic.
So in terms of EW, then currently, how is it more or less organized? You have like EW operators in a division, or you have them on battalion level, or I mean, of course, I think it probably depends on the different forces as well. So how is this now usually done?
I'm glad you asked that question, because this is an interesting topic in itself, because everybody has a slightly different philosophy with it. But broadly speaking, what you'll have, if you take the US Army as an example, the US Army has now moved to this brigade combat team structure that they have. And this is their maneuver force. This is the part that actually does the fighting and gets stuck in and has all the things that go bang. And equally that takes the maneuver force's actions from the Red Force. And what you would typically have is you would have an embedded unit, and it's probably, I think it will be about a company or battalion sized unit. I'm not 100% certain on that. But they would be tasked with effectively waging electronic warfare against the opponent. And increasingly in the US Army, cyber effects as well, because like we mentioned, as I was saying, about the British Army, sorry, I shouldn't have said as I was saying, we promised not to do that. But let me start that again. So what you have with the US Army is you have a dedicated unit in the maneuver force, in the brigade combat team, that will be battalion or company size, for instance. And their job is to wage electronic warfare on their opponents. So that's to attack their radio networks, to attack their communication systems, to attack their command and control systems using cyber effect, and to a lesser extent to attack their radars as well. So that would typically be any radars the Red Force is using for artillery fire control. It may be some radars that are being used for air surveillance, air control, that kind of thing. And typically that's sort of mirrored around NATO in a similar way. The British Army has 14th Signals Regiment. That is a dedicated unit that is tasked with electronic warfare. And that will be either provided in its whole, or it will be provided in a piecemeal fashion per battalion or squadron or whatever it might be to the maneuver force wherever they happen to be active at that time. If you look at what the Russians are doing, and if you look at the Chinese, what you see with the Russians is that they, in terms of their land forces, they have EW embedded right the way through the force, and it goes down to quite a low tactical level. So typically, if you take a Russian, typical Russian unit of maneuver, so like a motorized rifle division, or I think they're moving to a brigade structure now, they will have a dedicated electronic warfare company that is part of that division. And they will basically perform electronic warfare, I think it's out to about 50 kilometers beyond the tactical edge, effectively. That can ebb and flow, and that can move as the battle moves. But typically that's their line of responsibility. Anything that's above that 50 clicks becomes the responsibility of the sort of operational level EW. And what the Russian army do is they have EW brigades that provide that operational level. If you like, it's like a big bubble, it's like a sort of huge tent that's over the whole theatre, and they, or certainly a significant part of it, and they provide the operational level EW. What you're seeing now with the US military is that the US military is rediscovering this idea of having the operational level electronic warfare to support the land forces. So they're actually looking at having a brigade and above level electronic warfare system that they're going to bring in that's going to do that sort of theatre-wide electronic warfare. And that's sort of mirrored in the Chinese military. The Chinese military are interesting because they have a thing called the Strategic Support Force. And what that is that's an information operations command. And it is a dedicated force. So it's a self-contained command. And they are tasked with waging strategic / operational level electronic warfare, alongside other things like information warfare, cyber warfare, psyops, that kind of thing. But it's very, very tightly coordinated. It's all seen as one of the same things. And then at tactical level and below, that's the responsibility of their maneuver formation. So generally speaking, each army will have a dedicated EW unit that it then supplies to the maneuver force as and when required. But some will have dedicated EW units actually embedded within each part of the maneuver force. So they're the sort of two main ways it tends to be organised.
So with embedded, dedicated, you mean organically part of the unit? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Then one final question, would EMP, so an electromagnetic impulse from a thermonuclear warhead, classify as EW or not?
Yeah, I would classify it as EW, definitely. I think it depends how the effect is used. I mean, one of the sort of oft-quoted scenarios in terms of any major nuclear confrontation between the West and Russia is that it is likely that either side would probably sort of prelude their initial nuclear salvo with at least one or several very high altitude nuclear detonations. And what that would do, I mean, that would do a number of things. Firstly, it would signal intent. It may be used as a sort of, look, this is how far we're prepared to go. This, once, we've given you a warning, we've detonated 3 nuclear weapons at however, 100 miles up in the atmosphere or into space even. And that is unlikely to cause any physical damage on the ground. But what it will do is it will cause a huge amount of electrical damage. So any electrical systems that are unshielded, so don't have a Faraday cage around them or don't have any means of protecting their electronics against the electromagnetic pulse, will not work and can actually be ruined by that. They may simply be no longer function after that. So yes, you could argue that in the purest sense is an electronic effect and does fall into the electronic warfare definition. I think when you've got a case of a nuclear weapon being used kinetically, so to destroy people or to destroy buildings or both, and you have an electromagnetic pulse as a consequence of that, I would argue that that's standard kinetic warfare, which happens to have an EW effect. But yes, the HEMP, high altitude detonation of a nuclear weapon, and the electromagnetic pulse, I would absolutely classify that as EW.
Thank you very much for your time and insights.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.